Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Air. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is November 28th, 2018. Tonight, Trans-Mountain Expansion, TMX. The spin remains the same, with Robyn Allan. Trans-Mountain Expansion. Three words that evoke many different reactions from many different people. Despite a custom-designed approval process meant to ignore all evidence to question the project and promote easily disprovable benefit scenarios, the Federal Court of Appeal revoked Cabinet's certificate of approval for this project this past summer, which was immediately followed by the Government of Canada taking on all responsibility for it by handing Kinder Morgan an over 600% gain on their investment. Remember the campaigning Justin Trudeau insisting the process was flawed? There was no social license for the project. There was no suitable economic case for it. There was a facade of meaningful consultation. The Federal Court of Appeal decision agreed with that assessment. But a funny thing happened after the change in government. A ministerial panel delivered an opinion that said the existing flawed process was just fine now. Kinder Morgan held Ottawa hostage with excuses rather than the truth. TMX was never and will never be economically feasible. The choice for Ottawa was pay a very high political price or pay a very high monetary price. And we know what they chose, but it's a long way from the bill being totaled. Now, Ottawa has told their National Enegy Board they want an opinion report to approve TMX by February 22nd, 2019. All indications are they will get it. Despite strong evidence, TMX may well end up in the same place it sits now, halted for a failed process. Robyn Allan is an independent economist and has held many executive positions in the public and private sectors. She was an expert intervenor on economics, risk, and commercial need at the NEB Trans-Mountain Expansion hearings, and was an expert witness on economic and insurance issues for the NEB Northern Gateway process. The View Up Here welcomes Robyn back to discuss TMX and the risk to Canadian taxpayers on this future white elephant against facts and logic. Now, just before we start, I would like to mention that today, Harry Leslie Smith passed away at the age of 95. Not many people knew about Harry until he was nearly 90 years old. And he decided to make his last years all about educating and reminding people of what he had seen in his long life. I was lucky enough to see Harry speak live in 2015. Inspirational is a massive understatement. The wisdom, the grace, the humility, and the friendliness of the man, plus his life experiences that he reflected and drew parallels with today. Those who seek a fairer world have lost a great ally in Harry Leslie Smith. Rest in power, sir. When Robyn and I discussed what we would do with this episode, it basically focused on a letter that she wrote to the National Energy Board after she had resigned from the process, pointed out some rather large errors. But, as we'll hear tonight, this is kind of how the National Energy Board works. I wanted to start off with something that was completely nonpartisan. The cost, the simple cost of this project. And the fact that the National Energy Board was still working with numbers basically from 2015, 2014, and they're allowed to keep using them. We moved on to quite a few other things. Had a lot of fun doing this. And here we go. Robyn Allan. Well, the view up here is very honored and pleased to welcome back Robyn Allan for her second visit to the show. Welcome, Robyn.
Good to talk to you, Glenn.
Well, last time you were here, we talked about the circus, to be polite, that this process has become with the National Energy Board, the factors that led to your withdrawal from that project. And I refer to the letter that you sent to the National Energy Board in September. Now, I'm going to quote one thing that's absolutely at the heart of this matter from your letter. When the board determined to recommend approval for the Trans-Mountain Expansion project, it did so on the basis of balancing the project-related benefits against the project-related burdens and residual burdens. Now, I can think of no more fundamental point that you have to have clear to do that than the project cost. Now, way back in 2013, when this came forward, Kinder Morgan had a price of $5.5 billion. In October of 2015, Kinder Morgan themselves raised it to $6.8 billion. But then in May 2016, when the report came from the National Energy Board, magically they still said $5.5 billion. And then in February 2017, Kinder Morgan upped it to $7.4 billion. In August of this year, Kinder Morgan, in a submission to the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States, said they were looking at a top end of $9.3 billion. Now, Robyn, if you don't know what you're spending, is there any way you can measure benefits against burdens?
Well, no, and you see, it's interesting because here's the board's formula, as you read out, was they look at project-related benefits against project burden, which they say can be mitigated. That's what their conditions are all about, is that the burdens the project creates, we can solve that by having conditions. That's another issue, but that's what they say. And then the residual burdens are things like the adverse environmental effects on the orca whales, which, the project will likely fundamentally lead to their extinction. Now, those can't be mitigated, but because the board said we're not going to look at those under the Environmental Assessment Act, they said that it wasn't a problem. Now, the courts have said go back and look at the residual burdens, which is these adverse environmental effects, because it's the tanker traffic that's going to create them, and then come up with your decision about whether or not the burdens can be overshadowed by the benefits. Well, what the board has done is said we're going to just accept all the benefits we got during the first hearing that was done back in 2013 to 2015. We're just going to accept all that evidence Kinder Morgan gave us as the benefits, and then we're going to weigh that against these adverse residual burdens. Now, there is no way you can properly do that evaluation if you rely on the old hearing record, which is what the board's doing. And there is no way you can do that, even if you do rely on the hearing record, the way the board's done it. And that's because what the board says is that the project cost is a benefit. And so when that project cost doubles or almost doubles. I mean, 5.5 billion to at least 9.3. It's probably, well over that. The board would see that as a benefit. The board did not ever test whether or not Trans-Mountain's expansion was commercially viable, whether or not the toll rates that are triggered by significant capital costs would in fact be acceptable to the long-term shippers that have signed take-or-pay contracts. So what the board has done is it rigged the situation so that when it applies its formula, it will only get the result it wants, which is to recommend approval. And that's what the travesty is here, and that's how the public's been betrayed. So you're quite right. The board said projects worth $5.5 billion. They added in the allowance for funds used during construction. That's why it's not 5.4, but 5.5. Even though Trans-Mountain announced to its shareholders in October, or 7 months earlier than the report, that the cost had gone up to $6.8 billion. So the board ignored the truth and actually delivered to Cabinet a report that had the wrong information about how much the project budget was at that time.
So if the whole point of the Federal Court of Appeal decision, for a few different factors, was that the report to Cabinet was lacking and did not have correct information, how can they use the same record and pass on a report to Cabinet now when it's very public? To the Security and Exchange Commission, they're looking at a top end of 9.3. How can they use the same numbers?
Well, they can because they have so much authority. And the problem here is that we have a captured regulator that does the bidding of industry. It used to be Kinder Morgan Inc. in this case, and now it's the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada owns the project, as we all know, and now it's the proponent. And the Government of Canada says this project will be built, no matter what the cost is to Canadians and Canadian taxpayers, to society, to the environment. Justin Trudeau doesn't care. He's going to build this pipeline. And so by not looking at the market reality today, by not looking at the economic reality, by relying on a document that did not even then rely on the facts, they can pretend that this project should proceed when in fact it should not. Now they're relying on the fact that it's very difficult for a lot of Canadians to keep up with the shenanigans. It's very difficult for a lot of Canadians to understand how the board works and how it has leveraged its authority to rig the outcome to yes, to suggest that it's desirable in terms of commercial viability, in terms of economic impact, in terms of environmental impact. All of these three things to suggest it's okay to go ahead, when in fact any prudent person sitting down and looking at the facts would realize that this is a big con.
Well, I can certainly understand why you were motivated to leave the process when there's such obvious black and white numbers from the proponent at that time that significantly increases cost, and yet the board says, well, yeah, no, we didn't see that. They didn't come here and enter it into the hearing record, so it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And now that the owner is not even a private corporation, it's the Government of Canada, yeah, I can imagine there's not going to be a whole stampede to update. Like you said, if they can use the old evidence simply because they can, it doesn't sound very good going forward. And we have seen the Prime Minister, Minister Sohi, Minister Carr before him, simply make an off-the-cuff statement of, it will be built. So should there be more attention paid to the result before the process by the Canadian public?
Oh, yeah, there has to be a lot of attention made to what's really going on here. Now, you ask yourself, well, why would the board knowingly avoid having evidence put on the record that would update the capital cost? And the board received significant benefit from doing that. The board said it was looking at the financial viability of the project. That's part of its terms of reference. But by looking at a $5.4 billion capital cost, then that's all that they thought would need to be financed. Now, Kinder Morgan had told the board that they would provide all of the financing from the parent in Texas, that all the debt and equity required for $5.4 billion would be provided from internal sources. The board just accepted that. They never looked into it. Then in 2014, Kinder Morgan went through a significant reorganization and took on over $40 billion in debt. And I filed a motion because I was still an intervenor at the time and said, board, you have to look at this because Kinder Morgan Inc. is no longer capable of financing this project. So So you have to ask yourself the question, is it financeable? And the board refused. They said it was outside the scope of their review. By not looking at Kinder Morgan's financial viability, they not only didn't know whether they could finance a $5.4 billion project. When it was raised to $6.8 by the fall of 2015, the board still didn't know whether they could actually meet this new challenge of having to come up with even more financing. And the truth of the matter was Kinder Morgan couldn't. That's why Kinder Morgan said, okay, we'll go to the U.S. capital markets. Nobody there was interested in Trans-Mountain Expansion. They all knew that this was not a financially viable project, that it couldn't stand on its own commercial legs. And then Kinder Morgan said, okay, we'll take the Canadian operations public. And they took 30% of the Canadian operations public for $1.7 billion in gross proceeds. And now the public was led to believe by mainstream media that that money would be used to fund Trans-Mountain's expansion. But when you read the prospectus, it clearly says, no, the proceeds from going public in Canada will be siphoned off to Texas to pay off the parent company debt. And so we have a situation where they took the company public and weren't any closer to financing the project. So then they had to go to the markets and say, well, how are we going to get, by this time, the project's up to $7.4 billion. How are we going to get $7.4 billion in financing? Well, the Canadian banks provided a construction loan, but Kinder Morgan still had to come up with $2 billion in equity, and they couldn't do it. The Canadian capital markets were starting to get spooked. And so this is why Kinder Morgan left. They couldn't finance it. It wasn't a commercially viable project based on business criteria. And when they gave Ottawa the ultimatum on April 8th, they took Trans-Mountain hostage, either pay up or we're going to kill the project. They were actually holding the gun to their own head. Ottawa should have just said, fine, let it die because it's not commercially viable. But Ottawa went in and overpaid for the existing pipeline because that's the only way they could expand to a new one, because the existing pipeline subsidizes the new pipeline through higher toll rates. So we have this continuous stream of subsidies going on to try to make this project work. So the last thing I just want to say to that is that when Kinder Morgan walked away, they only had $200 million, about $200 million at risk. This is because they had really never put up any equity. Sure, they spent $1.1 billion trying to get the project through approval, but they had a guaranteed fund provided by the National Enegy Board, which subsidized the project. And that fund was used against that 1.1. So we're down to 900 million. Well, of that, 80% of those costs were going to be paid by the shippers, the 13 companies that had signed long-term contracts. So if Kinder Morgan had walked away, they would have only been on the hook for 200 million. When Ottawa came in and bought it all up, they basically bailed out big oil, the big oil companies. So they wouldn't be exposed to about 700 million in costs if the project failed. And now we have a situation where this project is being advanced by the Canadian government because they have pretty much infinitely deep pockets because of taxpayers to subsidize this project to make sure it can go forward when it should not.
I find it rather interesting that the acceptance, the propagation of part truths, fractional truths, and even non-truths are not only picked up by, say, oil lobbies or Kinder Morgan themselves, but it's picked up by governments. It's picked up by people across the spectrum. Currently, we have the Premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley, coming out and saying that Alberta is losing $80 million a day because this pipeline is not built. That is based on absolutely nothing other than picking a number out of the air, but that $80 million is a double down from the previous $40 million a day that Alberta is supposedly missing out on. And this is based on a report from Scotiabank that came out early this year, I believe in March. And their methodology is paper thin. And it doesn't take long for anybody who knows what they're doing to look at it and say this is a waste of effort. There's nothing here. And it relates to this big deal right now about the differential between West Texas Intermediate and Western Canadian Select. Could you explain how Scotiabank has created this image that actually has nothing to do with the reality?
I'll just explain a little bit about how the differential works to make sure that the listeners understand what the argument is. So we have Alberta Oil Sands oil that is a low quality crude. It costs more to upgrade and refine than light oil. And it costs money to transport it to market, where WTI is determined, which is Cushing, Oklahoma. Now, WTI is a light Texas Intermediate Oil. So WCS, which is the benchmark for our heavy oil in Alberta, is always going to sell at a discount to WTI. It's always going to for a natural discount for quality and transportation reasons. And that discount is about $15 US a barrel to $20 US a barrel. Now, what happens is that sometimes that natural discount can narrow or widen. It narrowed back a few years ago because OPEC cut their heavy barrel production. So the world demand for heavy oil wasn't being met, and so the value of the quality discount, the differential narrowed. Now, sometimes that differential will widen because of market conditions. If there's too much supply, then the differential will widen. If transportation costs go up, the differential can widen. So there's things that will affect it. The way the argument goes is that because there's a lack of pipeline capacity, the differential has basically blown out, and it sits at about $40 US a barrel right now. So what they do, and when Scotiabank did its report in February, the discount wasn't quite as extreme. The differential was wide, but it wasn't quite as wide. So what they did for their $15 billion a year or $40 million a day is they applied the discount to every barrel produced. Now, the question always has to be, because it doesn't matter what the spot price of heavy oil is. The question is how many barrels actually are affected by that price. So what's the exposure of supply to that price? Because if you're going to take that price, you got to make sure you actually apply it to the barrels that are affected. So what Scotiabank did, and I think it was out of ignorance to begin with, is that they applied it to every barrel produced as opposed to only looking at the barrels that were exposed. Now, let's take, for example, the oil sector in Alberta. A number of the major producers are also upgraders and refiners. And when a barrel of heavy oil goes into a refinery in Edmonton, if Suncor sends a barrel of heavy oil into its own refinery and turns it into gasoline and sells it in the market at world prices as if they paid Brent, they are not suffering any harm, period. So about 20% of the barrels are refined in Canada. So it's really hard to argue that those are affected by the discount. Now, Suncor tells its shareholders that none of the barrels, and it's about 30% of the market for diluted bitumen, none of its barrels are affected at all. And for three reasons. They get them to the Gulf Coast where they get world prices. They're not affected by WTI at all. They get the Maya world price, a benchmark based on that. And when they put them into their own refineries in Canada or US, or they put them on a pipeline with guaranteed access. So it's really reprehensible that we are being told that all the barrels are exposed when very few are. Now, I've done the analysis, and I get down to about maybe 1 in 5 barrels are actually exposed to the discount. So that's the first part of this great $80 million a day lie. Now, I did approach the Alberta government when they came out with the $80 million a day, as you're probably aware that Premier Notley has an ad campaign across Canada perpetrating this lie, and asked for their calculation, because the Scotiabank does provide its report and it shows us where its major flaws are. Alberta said they relied on that report, and so I asked for the calculation and they have been unable to provide it. I was told it was simply a $45 a barrel discount. Now, it's not clear whether that's US or Canadian, they won't tell me, and they won't tell me how many barrels they applied it to. And here again, there's another problem, because Scotiabank's report, when you read it, we know they applied the discount to both light and heavy. And Premier Notley is only talking about heavy. So there's huge obfuscation going on here, and we have a real-time revenue loss counter on Parliament Hill pretending this loss is being suffered when it is not. Now, the other part of the great lie is that it's because of a lack of pipeline capacity and only Trans-Mountain construction can solve it, and both of those claims are false. First of all, right now, one of the major reasons we're suffering a lack of pipeline capacity is because the Enbridge mainline system is having trouble holding oil producers to account for the barrels they nominate for space. So in other words, what happens every month on the Enbridge mainline system, because it's spot capacity, is the shippers have to nominate for space. And because the space is tight, what they have been doing for, Enbridge says it's for almost 2 years, is they've been nominating barrels that they don't actually have. Now, the industry calls these air barrels. It's when you say, I'm going to nominate for more space than I need, hoping that I get the space I want. And what the air barrels do, though, they're not innocuous. What they do is they change the ability of Enbridge to efficiently use its system over the month. People nominate for space they don't actually have the barrels for. Then they tell Enbridge a week or two into the month they don't have them, and Enbridge is scrambling trying to fill up the space that they allocated. CNRL says it's about up to 125,000 barrels a day, 125,000 barrels a day of capacity that's not being used because of this, because oil companies are lying about the barrels they have. Now, in the last quarter, it looks like maybe the number is closer to 200,000 barrels a day of capacity that isn't being used. We can tell from the pipeline throughput statistics that Enbridge supplies to the National Enegy Board. So really, the major problem right now is right on the backs of producers because they are really gaming the nomination system and allowing space to run idle. So the third part of the lie is, can Trans-Mountain Expansion solve this problem and heal the Alberta economy and the rest of Canada? The answer to that is no, it won't, because its space is not needed. Right now, we have Enbridge Line 3 being built. And I find this very interesting that you have Line 3 under construction, will be ready to operate by this time next year. And it's a project that costs just about, it's a $9 billion Canadian project. And there is nothing being discussed about how it will lead to improved economic performance, how it will solve the differential problem. It's as if Line 3 is not being built. And I think this is a deliberate strategy because if Trans-Mountain is going to deliver any of the benefits that are being touted, we should be seeing that with Line 3. And, you know, effectively, it's not even making a blip in terms of economic impact. We are being fed a false line here, but the point I want to make about Line 3's replacement project, it's going to expand throughput by at least 370,000 barrels a day. Now, it's built to go about 80,000 more than that. They're just not talking about that. So take a look, say 450,000 barrels a day capacity on that line. Plus, Enbridge tells its shareholders they have the ability to increase with other enhancements on their lines about 400,000 barrels a day. So we're looking at 800,000 barrels a day of capacity coming online within the next year or so. And when you look at the supply forecast for operating and in construction out of the oil sands, that capacity is enough. So Trans-Mountain's not needed in terms of pipeline capacity. And therefore, none of the three, it's two parts. We've got this huge discount. It's applied to every barrel. It's because of pipeline capacity and only Trans-Mountain can solve it. None of those parts are truthful.
I think it's also interesting the reluctance of any government or any mainstream media to do what you do and actually go to the statistics that are available to refute these unicorn stories. I mean, to return to the so-called differential, Steve Williams is the CEO of Suncor, and he said we have virtually no exposure to the light-heavy differential. CNRL, Cenovus, Imperial, Husky, they all say something close to the same thing. And it's because, as you explained, you can't just say oil is oil. Every barrel is getting hit. It's nowhere near the truth. Recently in Alberta, we've seen a public statement by the CEO of Cenovus that the Alberta government should enact a clause that they can use to limit production. Now, does that have more to do with what you mentioned? Like Suncor bought Petro-Canada quite a few years ago, and they're the biggest refinery in Edmonton. Used to be Petro-Canada. Now it's Suncor. So I see what you're saying about the bigger the differential is, they don't care because they're on both ends of this transaction. And like you said, doesn't matter what they pay for it. When you go to the pump, oh, it's world price. Sorry, that's how it works. This whole story about Canadians and Albertans missing out on so much money, shouldn't the actual narrative be that our friends, our multinational buddies in big oil are the ones who are missing out on money because there's been no change to the royalty structure? Is that more accurate?
It's hard to see how the big oil companies are missing out on any money. They're not, because they're not missing out on any money at all because they're able to make it up in their refinery operations, and they're getting it to market in the United States, pretty much most of the barrels at very high value prices. You know, if I am an oil producer in Canada and have a long-term contract to deliver heavy oil to a refinery in Whiting, I'm protected from the differential in spot market. There's no impact. So you see, the people that are really getting hurt here are Albertans. And building a pipeline is not going to solve that. It will just continue because it's based on the same model of how they're taken advantage of. And it's two ways. One is the royalty structure is based on the crude oil price, not on the profits the companies that benefit from the oil are making. If the royalty structure looked at how much money are companies making from the resource rather than how much is a crude barrel selling on the market, it would be a very different story in terms of the royalties flowing to the province. And the province looked at that recently, and they decided not to ensure that the oil companies that benefit actually pay their fair share. And then the second way that Albertans are hurting is they're paying world prices at the pump as if they didn't have any crude oil resources. Imperial Oil just said in its latest investor presentation that their gas gets Brent pricing. So how is that fair? So really, there's a double whammy going on for Canadian or for Alberta residents who are supposed to be the owners of the resource. The other thing that I find really curious is when you have a CEO of Cenovus come out and say that they want government to intervene in the marketplace to restrict the output of barrels on every producer, but does not want government to be involved in any of its other activities when it's trying to regulate their behavior. So it's really a duplicitous approach to asking for government aid, asking for government welfare. And, really, it'll be a very sad day if the Alberta government comes out and allocates a production control on all producers. What we're witnessing in the oil sands right now is a fight among the titans. We've got Imperial, Suncor, and Husky, who have made sure they have an integrated strategy to protect their barrels with upgrading and refining. And, even Husky's buying out MEG Energy because they can protect another 100,000 barrels a day, whereas MEG can't. So that's the hostile takeover there is, you had a strategy, MEG, that you didn't protect yourself. Now we're going to benefit from that. If Cenovus is hurting, it's Cenovus' own making. And the only way to discipline large companies that have been subsidized so heavily by Canadian taxpayers from day one is to show a little tough love here and say, the game's up. Major international producers have sold their oil sands assets. And they sold them to CNRL and they sold them to Cenovus and other parties because they know the writing is on the wall, that value of oil sands crude in the world is falling because of real market conditions. There is a reduction in the demand for it. We have a huge increase in the supply of light oil worldwide that parties really didn't expect until a few years ago. And we have International Maritime Organization low sulfur content rules that is really going to kick up the bottom of the market for heavy oil. So the world says we don't want it. And now we have producers that are being irresponsible saying we want to continue to produce it and have our bad business decision be underwritten. I mean, it violates every principle, not only of the market, but of business, society, and the environment. It just does not make sense.
Another big fairy tale that has played for a few years now and is used again by politicians or CAP or whoever wants to make their quote-unquote point on a certain day was a big part of the benefit and not benefit part that the National Enegy Board used, and that was the Muse-Stansel report. This has been proven by you, by other parties, ever since it came out, that this is simply not an accurate document to use to make a point. But again, as you said, the National Enegy Board, with their omnipotence in what they see and what they don't see, included it. The Muse-Stansel report estimated that the Trans-Mountain Expansion could increase producers' revenues by $73 billion by opening up Asian markets and increasing North American prices. None of that is true, is it?
No, it's not. And you see here again, the Muse-Stansel report says it's going to be $73.5 billion over 20 years. That's about $10 million a day. It's exactly the same false analysis that Scotiabank relied on, because what Muse did is it applied it to every barrel produced. When I, as an intervenor, raised issues about you can't apply it on every barrel because Canadian oil refiners, when the price of crude goes up, they take a hit. So you have to net that off. And the board basically said the impact on oil refiners is outside the scope of their review. This is how the board rigs their evaluation. They say the only benefit, this is how their calculation works, the only benefits we are going to consider are the benefits to oil producers. We will not consider any costs to any other sector of the economy, including refiners, including the rail sector, including commercial fishing. You have the biggest union in Canada saying if Trans Mountain's built, it's going to be a significant economic cost in the fishing sector, and the board would not consider that. So Muse Standstill is fundamentally flawed for many reasons beyond that. One of the assumptions in that report is that there are no other pipelines that will ever be built again, ever, except Trans-Mountain. So Muse Standstill doesn't look at Line 3 replacement as a possibility or Keystone XL. So if you have an analysis that suggests there's no new pipeline capacity from 2015 on, except for Trans-Mountain, of course you're going to be able to cook the benefits to look like they're substantial. Now, there's even been capacity brought online since 2015 that's ignored in that report, and then Line 3 is going to be on next year, and then the other enhancements. So Trans-Mountain becomes redundant, but the board is going to rely on a benefits case that says it's not.
If this was an actual benefit against not benefit analysis by the National Enegy Board, and they are being told to revisit this as ordered by the federal court, wouldn't the Muse Standstill report be removed and everything else would be amended to fit that? Because it's a lie. Wouldn't that be the right thing to do?
Well, yeah, it would be it's hard to argue that the Muse Standstill report is even relevant today, even if it was accurate and reliable in 2015. So much has changed. This is another false assumption that the board is relying on, and it's in their report, is that they assume that the same amount of crude oil will be produced whether or not Trans-Mountain is built. And as a result, what Muse Standstill did is it said that if it doesn't go by Trans-Mountain, because remember, no other pipelines will ever be built, but for Trans-Mountain in his analysis, it'll go by rail instead. And then he says rail is more expensive. And therefore, when you substitute Trans-Mountain for rail, you get a benefit. Well, what about the cost to the rail companies? Because they were making money. If that was true, if in fact it was true, those assumptions about supply, and it would move by rail instead, we do have a Canadian rail sector, and it does get paid to ship oil by train. So if you displace Trans-Mountain's capacity and take it off of rail, that's a cost to the rail sector. Forget about whether or not it's safe. Forget about any of the other aspects. On an economic analysis basis of a cost benefit, that is a cost to the rail sector when you take the barrels off the trains and you put them on a pipeline. Now, Muse says it's more expensive. Imperial Oil says rail is not more expensive, but that's another story. When the board was approached about them ignoring the costs of Trans-Mountain, the board said it was outside the scope of the review. So the board doesn't care about other sectors of the Canadian economy. It only cares about the oil producers and what the oil producers say they want. And so when the benefit says Trans-Mountain's pipeline and doesn't look at the cost, it is rigged to suggest the pipeline should proceed. That's unconscionable. The board would say we will not look at other sectors of the economy. The board does not do a cost-benefit analysis. It does a gross benefit to oil producers analysis. And that's all it does. And it does that based on false analysis like the Muse Standstill report that has assumptions that make no sense. They didn't even make sense in 2015, let alone now. But it's interesting because the board actually used to require cost-benefit analysis as part of its requirements under a public interest review. When the board found that cost-benefit analysis suggested that a project should not proceed, instead of accepting that, the board then decided they would not accept cost-benefit analysis anymore because having any analysis to suggest a project should not proceed is outside the board's interest.
I think that is the absolute definition of a captured regulator, is it not?
It is. And it's interesting because a former chair of the NEB, Roland Priddle, explained that this is what the board did when he appeared before Northern Gateway, that cost-benefit analysis used to be required, but then when it showed we shouldn't proceed, they stopped relying on it.
Now, the other thing about Muse was it said that it would decrease differentials, shipping to Asia, it would be more efficient use of a system, blah, blah, blah. But as David Hughes with CCPA and you yourself and other people have exposed, using Trans-Mountain for so-called Asian markets, which do not exist and do not appear to be existing anytime in the future, this could actually be more expensive than using Line 3, using KXL, and using rail. I mean, another issue is the Muse report, I'm sure, is based on a capital cost of $5.4 billion. So this is toilet paper, is it not?
I mean, it's really interesting because we keep being told that the tidewater access is critical to get the oil to Asia where they'll pay a higher price. But there's no evidence to suggest the price in Asia is higher when you actually look at the price for heavy oil. We also know that the heavy oil that goes there now that is remotely comparable to the oil sands is Mexican Maya. And Mexico, the national oil company, Pemex, tried to penetrate the Far East market. So they started to try to increase their shipments there. Now, we're only talking, 125, 200,000 barrels a day. Remember, Trans-Mountain is supposed to carry 540,000 barrels a day of heavy oil. How you think that huge amount of volume can penetrate a market immediately the way Muse suggests is beyond me. But so here's what happened to Pemex. They tried to increase their supply to Far East, and they found that they had to actually drop their prices to do it. They were receiving far lower prices in Asia when they tried to increase supply there. They stopped doing it. They found that it wasn't worth it, and they are going to the market that makes sense, which is the Gulf Coast, because the refineries there are configured to accept the heavy oil. But more importantly, the question really does become, how much is it going to cost to deliver a barrel of oil to Northeast Asia? And when I run the numbers with a $9.3 billion capital cost, which is a more realistic one, and tanker rates that are reasonable, because Muse relied on falsely deflated toll rates and tanker rates, even based on 5.4. You're looking at something close in 2022, which is probably the first year this pipeline could ever be built. You're looking at something close to $15 a barrel to get it there. And that does make it more expensive than rail. So the suggestion that somehow Trans-Mountain is going to be preferential to other markets in North America is ridiculous. But here's the problem. If Justin Trudeau continues to give oil producers in Canada a pipeline that's not needed, what's going to have to happen is the toll rates are going to have to be subsidized because the shippers will balk at the toll rates reflected by the capital cost that exists now. And so Canadian taxpayers will subsidize the tolls that will give wrong market signals to where this oil should go. And so we're going to put our oceans at risk when it doesn't even make commercial sense. It's just, it has become, you can't explain the insanity of what is taking place here with continuing to push forward on a pipeline to markets that are not configured to accept the oil. I mean, yes, there are some teapot refineries in Asia that use heavy oil, but those markets are served. You've already got the heavy oil markets in Asia being served by the existing suppliers, many of them Saudi Arabian. You can't expect to replace supply that has years of relationships with unproven oil. It just doesn't work that way. That's not how the market functions. So in order to try to make inroads, you need one of two things. You either drop your prices to try to crowd out existing relationships, which is unlikely to happen, as Pemex found, or you get refineries to invest in the ability to use your oil, which is not happening. China is not doing that. So it really is an illusion about markets existing there. And I'll say one more thing about this notion that somehow there's a value to be achieved if we build a pipeline to Tidewater. On what basis can any Canadian believe the situation will be different if diluted bitumen is sent to Asia than what's happening with diluted bitumen being sent to the United States? It's the refiners that have the leverage. The refiners in Canada, they have the leverage. They have an asymmetrical reason for keeping the differential wide, because every barrel that goes in at a lower cost feedstock, they make more money on when they sell it at world prices. They pay lower royalties when they can get the feedstock price down. What we're witnessing right now is that it is beneficial to refineries to have a wide differential, whether those refineries are in Canada, the US, or Asia. So why would we ever expect anything different if all we are doing is building a diluted bitumen pipeline to Asia, that the differential will not have a downward pressure on it? You can't do the same thing twice and expect a different outcome.
And of course, this is all enabled because now there is always Uncle Ottawa to offer subsidy, to pick up shortfalls, to make it appear as if this is a functioning system. The shippers themselves must be feeling pretty insulated now when the operator is able to cover any sort of shortfall, because don't the shippers now, haven't they been given a free pass with the Canadian government buying the system?
It depends upon what happens going forward. If the project proceeds, because of the firm service agreements, the FSA contracts with shippers, terms of those contracts say a number of things. One of the things that they say is if the project is canceled before all the conditions are waived by the owner, it used to be Kinder Morgan and now it's Ottawa, the shippers have to bear 80% of the costs to date. So if the project is canceled, say in the next 6 months, the contracts say the shippers are on the hook for 80% of the cost to date. But if Ottawa gets another certificate from the NEB and is allowed to proceed with the project, and Ottawa waives certain conditions, Ottawa will be on the hook for 100% of the costs, whether or not the project is completed. This is where the burden shifts significantly to Canadian taxpayers. I expect the National Enegy Board is going to recommend approval because they've heard clearly from Ottawa that Ottawa wants to proceed. If the project proceeds and Ottawa waives its rights to cancel, then a year down the road, let's say there's new court cases and the certificate is quashed again, Ottawa, will be on the hook, and that means us. The fact that Ottawa is holding so many cards to its chest when we are the owner of this pipeline is unconscionable. We deserve accountability and transparency on what this situation is costing us and what the burden is we're going to have down the road. Because right now, it looks to me like a lot of backroom deals can be made between producers in Ottawa to insulate the oil sector from costs and put them on the backs of taxpayers.
So with this drive from Ottawa, redirecting the National Enegy Board, saying publicly before that redirection even came, this pipeline will get built. I imagine from a shipper point of view, they're just sitting in their chairs, tapping their fingers, waiting for that certificate to be given to the government of Canada. And then they're free and clear. Everything after that, they get to make the call. Is that correct?
Yeah, just as Kinder Morgan used its leverage because of Canadian government compromise by political gain, they decided to invest in this project. Kinder Morgan Inc. leveraged that. I mean, they were hardly on the hook for anything, and they walked away, with $3 billion to Texas. So they got the money from the proceeds from the IPO, the initial public offering, and then they got another $3 billion or so because they own 70%. So all we've seen from this project is money siphoned out of the Canadian economy. Now we've got a situation where the shippers are going to leverage their power to get Ottawa to do their bidding. And we have less and less opportunity to find out what that looks like because they're not providing enough information on the situation now of what this project's costing and what it's likely to cost to build it. So yeah, the shippers are in the driver's seat. Now let's take a look at the shippers. Why might they want a pipeline that they actually don't need? Why go into long-term contracts and pay $5 or $6 a barrel because they only have to pay the fixed cost if they don't use the space. That's what a long-term take-or-pay contract is. It says you will pay for the space whether or not you use it, but it's only the fixed cost. So why would you do that? Well, there's not really a need for more capacity, pipeline capacity. What there is, from the shipper's point of view, is a need for more pipeline, because the shippers are having a tough time keeping the pipelines they have safe. We saw that happen with Keystone in November when it failed and it went offline, and barrels that were not exposed to the differential because they were now not able to get to the Gulf Coast under long-term contract, they were backed up into the spot market, and we saw the differential get blown out. What shippers want is, if there's a failure like Keystone or Line 6B when the Kalamazoo spill happened, the same kind of situation happened with differentials, is they want opportunities to use capacity on other systems that is not being used. So if even we take a look at Trans-Mountain, we've got a 65-year-old pipeline, and we've got a new one that wants to be built. They build the new one, the old one fails, and they just use the excess capacity on the new one and don't get any interruption to their business. But meanwhile, of course, the environment in British Columbia, let's say it spills into the Fraser River, we've got a serious problem to clean up. This is where the truth is not coming out, that there are other motivating factors that would cause companies to go into long-term contracts way beyond commercial considerations about the need for the space. $5, $6 a barrel is not a very expensive insurance contract to keep you protected if other pipelines fail.
So when you take an objective view of the realities, this project has, in effect, nothing to do with the benefit of the Canadian taxpayer or the Canadian job seeker or anything else. This entire project has to do with the security of oil companies. Is that correct?
This project is underwriting companies, oil companies in Alberta, that have shown by their behaviors they do not care about the Canadian economy or society or environment. That their behaviors with what they're doing around the apportionment on Enbridge right now is that the system isn't being used efficiently, but The winners from that process won't allow the process to be changed. And that is because they care about their bottom line. Now, that's fair enough. That's what companies do. They're required to respond to their shareholders. But to ever think that they are somehow going to behave socialistically, and the way they talk is, we care about our employees, we care about the environment, we care about society, we care about Canada. No, they don't. They care about the money they can make and their shareholders. And that's what they're supposed to do. So when we confuse the situation by suggesting that the benefits they get will somehow trickle down to the rest of us, it just does not happen in practice. And that's why you have to have regulatory discipline to support companies to behave in a manner that benefits them, but also benefits the economy, society, and the environment, because it won't happen otherwise. But when you have a captured regulator and now a captured Ottawa and a captured Alberta government, then you don't get a fair sharing of the benefits. I just think it's really important for, Canadians to think about what we're being told by governments and by mainstream media and by lobby groups. Think very carefully about it, because, when you start to connect the dots, it becomes pretty clear that we're being told one thing while something else very different is being done. And that's a deliberate strategy of distraction. That's part of how propaganda works, is you try to distract people from what's really taking place. And what's really taking place here is that at a time when we need to figure out how to diversify our economy, at a time when we need to make sure that fossil fuel extraction growth doesn't occur, production levels could stay where they are, but the growth in the oil sands cannot continue to happen. And a time when we need to figure out a way to protect our renewable resources like air, water, and land, and the ecosystem, what's happening is everything's being done to harm it, to harm growth and jobs, to harm the distribution of the wealth of the resources. And so we have to be really, really cognizant that that's what's taking place here and call it. We have to call it.
Well, I have to say, Kinder Morgan played a really good game of Enron. They limited their risk. They played along as hard as they could. They had a viable mark in the Canadian government who made this a political survival issue. Do you think that there will be any disruption along the refocused, quote-unquote, National Enegy Board proceedings? Do you think that we will get a certificate? Would you care to estimate when it'll be?
Well, Ottawa has been very clear. I mean, the board still has to make a decision, and only the board knows for sure how captured it is. But Ottawa has been very clear they want the decision by February 22nd, and it would take maybe a matter of weeks after that to issue the certificate. We have to remember that the board will only recommend whether or not to proceed with the project and provide conditions that it deems desirable should the project proceed. So the decision to issue the certificate really rests with Cabinet. So we've already been told the Cabinet's going to approve the project. Something serious would need to occur for Cabinet not to issue that certificate when they've been very clear that they plan to do it, and they have the final say. The board only makes a recommendation of whether or not Cabinet should proceed based on its estimation of adverse environmental effects. Are those adverse environmental effects, which is actually already identified, exist? Are they justifiable under the circumstances? And that's the only real difference here with the reconsideration is the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act lens has to be applied to the question. And the question that has to be asked is, are the adverse environmental effects that the board has already identified justified under the circumstances? And then the board will say that how do we justify it? We do it on the basis of benefits, and those benefits are flawed.
Well, I'd like to move on to one of the next points in your letter to the NEB requesting them to actually have some accurate information. And you quoted a statement in the National Enegy Board report. As a result of an open season process, 13 companies entered into binding 15 to 20-year transportation service agreements with Trans-Mountain, which came up to approximately 80% of the expanded system's nominal capacity. The agreements provide for a sharing of risks between Trans-Mountain and its shippers during the development stage, including the construction of the project and the long-term operations of the system. This statement is incorrect. The agreements that provide for a sharing of risks between Trans-Mountain and its shippers during the development stage, including construction of the project, are not the transportation service agreements. They are the firm service agreements. The TSAs are agreements that pertain to the long-term operations of the pipeline system. The board reviewed both the TSAs and the FSAs as part of Part 4 toll methodology hearing, not the hearing that resulted in the report. Robyn, how do you explain to people what the base difference is between the Transportation Service Agreement and the Firm Service Agreement, because they have a huge difference in impact on if this project even goes forward?
Yeah, exactly. And I think really what the error in the board's report does is it shows that the board did not properly understand the contracts. And the Part 4 hearing, the panel then did look at both of these contracts, and they were discussed quite extensively at the Part 4 hearing. The Part 4 hearing is when they look into the toll methodology that will be applied if the project goes forward. But you see, the unique feature of the National Energy Board is that the hearing record of one hearing does not naturally go into the hearing record for a related hearing. So there was nothing in the Part 4 hearing that this panel in the Part 3, which is a public interest review, could draw on unless it was filed on the hearing record. And so while the National Energy Board said it understood the contracts with shippers to be firm, that's the firm in the Firm Service Agreement, the FSA, the board never actually looked at the contracts. It never asked Kinder Morgan to file them. So it made representations to Cabinet about financial viability of the project being underpinned by long-term shippers and never bothered to look at the contracts themselves. And this is where it becomes really critical, because it's the Firm Service Agreement, the agreement about how what the tolls will be, how the cost of the project will be allocated. That's the one that really speaks to whether or not the project's financially viable. And so that paragraph in the board's report just exposed the fact the board really didn't know what it was talking about. It never asked for the contracts. It never looked at them. And then those contracts have a couple of really important things. The first thing the contract says in Clause 2 is all the shippers have to promise that for as long as the project is before the regulatory review, which it was at the hearing, they needed to support the project. So even if shippers had decided that they no longer needed the space on Trans-Mountain because the world has changed and now Line 3 is being built in Keystone XL, they can't say anything. They are contractually obligated to only speak well of the project. Now, had the board reviewed the contract, they would have seen that clause, and they would have known, therefore, that maybe the evidence the shippers were putting before them was biased by the terms of that clause. The other thing that's really important about those contracts is that's where we find out that the $6.8 billion is really critical. That if the cost of the project go from 5.5 to 6.8, the shippers can leave. But the board never advised Cabinet because the board pretended the shippers couldn't. Now, why this is so important, and why not only does it mean that the report erred, not only does it mean it shows that the board didn't properly evaluate the financial viability of this project, and that's the first question that should be answered before you proceed with, is it environmentally harmful? Because if it's not financially viable, it shouldn't go forward. Here's the biggest problem, is that because that certificate is now quashed, and one doesn't exist, the reconsideration process is likely to result in a new contract. Well, that means the shippers are now free to walk again. And Ottawa needs to know that if the certificate is issued, which Ottawa has said they want, they need to know that the shippers will be presented with a higher capital cost budget. Maybe something even higher than $9.3 billion. And that will actually determine what the tolls are that those shippers will pay. So now you're looking at, if the shippers agreed to $7.4 billion and that triggered a certain toll rate for each barrel to be shipped, say that's $7.50, then you get a $9.3 billion budget and that toll rate's going to go up. Well, now you've got shippers that have signed on that say, well, we've got other options. They're cheaper to get to the Gulf and cheaper to get to the Midwest of the U.S. In fact, rail's cheaper than sending this stuff to Northeast Asia. We're done. We're gone. But here's the real clincher. What will likely happen is that the shippers will know how desperate the Trudeau government is to build this pipeline, and they will come back and say, well, now we have an exit clause available to us that we didn't before under the earlier certificate. All our clauses were closed after we agreed to $7.4 billion. Now we have a chance to walk. Ottawa, if you really want to build this pipeline, you need to subsidize our toll rates because the capital cost of this project is now too high. And then agreements will be made and Canadians will start to be paying an unfair burden for the tolls on this project. That's my real concern. And so unless it's very clear that shippers have this opportunity to walk and then use that opportunity to leverage subsidies, the Canadian public will probably not be made aware of it.
Do you think that that is the reason that the federal government has been so reluctant to give any number for what they see construction costs to be? Because as soon as they do that, they're opening that Pandora's box of being coerced by the shippers. You know, they say, oh, well, that's really cool. I guess that empty pipeline is going to cost you a pretty penny because we're not shipping for those kind of costs. Do you see a scenario where new FSAs will be negotiated before the public hears any construction estimates that can be held?
I mean, I have a lot of questions about this, about how much can be discussed without going to another, what they call an open season, which means that the pipeline company, Trans-Mountain Corporation owned by the Canadian government, has to go and provide an opportunity for everybody that's interested in shipping to understand what the new terms would be. So I understand that they would have to do a new open season, which would result in an agreement. And then the board, if it changed the methodology, the board would have to look at it. But that doesn't say that discussions behind closed doors can't be ongoing, where general comments are made about a reluctance if prices go up. My belief is the federal government is not telling us what the capital costs are because the public would be so upset. You know, this is a major project. The last budget was February 2017 for $7.4 billion, and that was not a construction budget. That was what they call a Class 2-3 budget. It has, significant room for error. It's not based on contracts with contractors necessarily. And so, not only is this project now delayed 2 years longer than the $7.4 billion budget thought, but costs are going to likely be higher when those contracts with contractors are signed. And so my belief is that Ottawa is very reluctant to provide a new capital cost estimate because it's going to be clear that these project costs have in fact gone up and maybe even much higher than $9.3 billion.
Is this not the perfect scenario for shippers where you have a government that owns this project and the political costs override the monetary costs, even if those monetary costs are crippling to the Canadian economy? Is this a situation where they've painted themselves into this corner that we're going to build this project come hell or high water?
It provides a huge amount of leverage for shippers, just as Kinder Morgan had a huge amount of leverage. I mean, Trans-Mountain Expansion has never been financially viable, not from the beginning. Kinder Morgan knew that. I mean, you can read the transcripts from their earlier calls with analysts. Richard Kinder knew it was very unlikely to get permission to build a pipeline through an urban center like Burnaby. They knew the costs were going to be high. I mean, Steve Keen in 2014 said capital costs tend to get out of control. And they got a subsidy in 2011 with the firm service fee that the shippers, the oil producers said, NEB, do not provide this fee, this firm fee to Kinder Morgan, because if Kinder Morgan wants to advance its project, it should go out to capital markets and get the money to do it. But the NEB said, no, we'll give them $289 million to help them through the regulatory process. Never been done before. Then they got the cross-subsidization of the existing pipelines toll rates are now going to more than double to help pay for the new pipeline. So that means local markets like British Columbia, motorists at the pump through higher toll costs are going to pay for the expansion to foreign markets. That's another subsidy. Kinder Morgan went to the Alberta government when Redford was premier and tried to get the government to provide loans, and the government said, no, we're not interested in that. They've been looking for handouts all the way along. And when they decided in April of last year, they sent the ransom note that said, we're holding Trans-Mountain hostage unless you pay up. Kinder Morgan knew it wasn't financially viable because here's another unique feature in the firm service agreement. After the $7.4 billion that the shippers agreed to in February of 2017, and some of the shippers were replaced, not a lot, but a few of them, one of them actually walked and was replaced, okay? But at $7.4 billion, they agreed to pay the toll rates that relate to 7.4. But after that point, capital cost increases were shared by Kinder Morgan, Canada, and the shippers. So Kinder Morgan Canada knew it was starting to be on the hook for capital costs. And because Kinder Morgan Canada doesn't own oil it ships down the pipeline, it didn't have anywhere to get the revenue to pay for those tolls or that portion of the capital costs that they were going to bear. And so what that meant is a drain on their revenues, and they weren't interested in facing that. When they walked away, they actually only walked away with a $200 million obligation. And that's because had they canceled the project then, the shippers would have paid 80% of the cost to date for the project. So now Ottawa has picked it up, and they picked up the whole $1.1 billion. They actually provided a subsidy to oil producers by picking the project up and keeping it alive. So what do we have? A situation now is Ottawa is going to be under pressure to keep the cost to shippers at 7.4, even though the capital cost of the project is going to be well above that. Even though the terms of the contract says that when the shippers are faced with a higher budget, they have to pay all the cost. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out and how Ottawa tries to represent this is a good deal when it's very likely that there's going to be a burden of the capital costs on the backs of Canadian taxpayers.
This is definitely sounding to me like this entire project, Trans-Mountain Expansion, has now turned into a political exercise. It has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with fair return to the citizens who supposedly on paper are the owners of the resource. This has become a political legacy, if you will, at this point in time before anything has even started. And if shippers are going to be insulated and incentivized to remain in this project, that's going to come out now, not from Kinder Morgan's pockets, but from Canadian taxpayers' pockets. So is this a point of no matter how many facts are presented, how many realities are acknowledged, the Trudeau government simply will not, and at this point politically cannot, admit the truth and say that this is not viable. This is a disaster, and the time has come to end the charade. They're never going to do that at this point, are they? They're just going to pass on whatever the costs turn out to be to the Canadian public because they have that
and based
power.
on what they've done to date, yes, they will offload it onto us. But there is a possibility that presented with an accurate and reliable capital cost and holding those shippers to their contracts, if those shippers are held to their contract and the capital cost is accurate and reliable, that is, they don't try to pretend that costs to date aren't included and things like that. There's all sorts of ways they could present it as a lower capital cost than it's likely to be. So if they held the shippers to the contract and were honest about the cost to construct, you could see a situation where the shippers will say, it's too expensive, we don't need it, thanks very much. And it just dies from natural commercial causes. And everybody can save face. So if Ottawa actually does hold the shippers to their contracts, we could have a very different outcome than if Ottawa continues to hand out subsidies to large oil producers.
But Ottawa is the only one. A state government is the only one that can provide this sort of open-ended security that no matter what happens, things are still going to go
that's why
forward.
this is what concerns me is Minister Monod continues to suggest that private interests would be willing to buy the existing pipeline and the expansion once it's operational. But if Ottawa doesn't ensure that strong negotiation with shippers and market reflection terms have been adhered to, like if Ottawa hands out subsidies and doesn't force the shippers to pay for the project, then there's not going to be any other interests that are going to pick it up because they won't take on the burden that Ottawa is taking on. So unless Ottawa just says, okay, we will, write off the subsidies and we'll keep absorbing them and then sells the assets at bottom basement prices so that some private company is interested. Again, so that's a double hit for the public. So you've got to stay strong and behave prudently from a business perspective when you negotiate the deals with shippers. And then if the shippers decide to go forward, that's their choice. But if you don't do that, then there's no private company that's going to be interested unless you even take on more of a subsidy burden. Now, we've seen that with other situations, bailouts all the time, where in order to get the private sector to take on assets, you give them huge benefits. We've seen that happen too.
It just sounds very unlikely to me that even if this project does get built under these conditions, under what we can expect to see moving forward, when the realization comes that there are no Asian markets, when the realization comes that our customer base has been engineered by multinationals to get us to this point in time, doesn't it just become more of an issue of either you keep playing the game and we basically dictate the terms, and you over there, the owner with the unlimited pocketbook, are simply going to pay what we determine to be acceptable, and you're not faced with likely losing being government over this process that could have been stopped years ago, but you guys wanted to keep going down this road because of the political benefits. Now, Canadians could be caught with paying subsidies to producers, to refiners, to any new markets they find, because isn't that another fact of how this world works? If there was actually a new market that said, okay, we're willing to take a look at your product, we're willing to take it on. Well, wait a minute. Look at all the deals you're giving to everybody else under the sun to actually use this infrastructure. We want the same deals. Do you see a possibility in the future where upgraders in Southeast Asia would say, yeah, we're willing to take your product, but what are you going to cover for us? Doesn't this set a precedent that you're never going to get to profitability?
Well, I think that precedent was set the minute the project was advanced without making sure it was financially viable. As soon as the National Enegy Board subsidized the advancement of this project, the course was set. And that's what we've consistently seen is that, the NEB made precedenting decisions that were not consistent with prudent action, and now Ottawa's doing it. And, the oil sector is picking its cue up from what Kinder Morgan got away with. Ottawa is not a very effective negotiator. And regrettably, if they were actually standing firm on protecting the public interest, they would be able to secure a lot more for us. But, they're being very, very weak about it all because they really don't believe that, the whole idea that Trans-Mountain can fund a transition to a low-carbon economy speaks a lot to the problem we have here, that they're thinking about a future where we do not have a problem with climate change and global warming, and we do not have a problem with world markets that have set GHG requirements, like for the International Maritime Organization that has got the low sulfur rules, which is going to take the bottom out of the heavy oil market. These realities that are not being looked at when you have a recent report by scientists that says if we don't take serious action within 12 years, we won't be able to address this problem. So you've got this pipeline project being advanced on a time horizon of false benefits over 20 years, and we only have really maybe 10 years to seriously address this problem. And building a pipeline that's going to expand oil sands production isn't going to address it. That speaks to what you said earlier about the 100 megaton cap. It doesn't really do anything meaningful. And so, you look at all the market factors, don't even consider the environmental factors, and the market is sending serious signals that this project's not financially viable. It can only be advanced if taxpayers pay for it. And it's not economically beneficial for numerous reasons. It crowds out interests. The benefits aren't there. The market in Asia will only exist if the product is deeply discounted. You can't expect to go into a market in Asia and get a higher price. First of all, the higher prices don't exist even for man crude, which is a heavy oil equivalent. And secondly, on any kind of new market development, when has a product ever commanded a higher price than its substitute? It just doesn't happen. So, really, no matter how you look at this project, it doesn't make sense. And it's continuing to be advanced, limp along on life support because taxpayers are subsidizing it and will continue to subsidize it.
Now, moving on to the confusion, which should not be there at all, about marine traffic, which leads us back to the Federal Court of Appeal decision. But as you pointed out in your letter to the National Enegy Board, in the report, it said that the existing Westridge Marine Terminal, WMT, loads 5 tankers per month. Well, that is not true. During the period of the review, the WMT typically loaded 2.5 tankers a month. For the 5-year period 2013 to 2017, WMT typically loaded 2 tankers per month. For the 5 years prior to Trans-Mountain filing its application, WMT did not load 5 tankers a month. And there are publicly available statistics to back this up. Now, as you mentioned, and the question I have, is Trans-Mountain had all these numbers. It's their business. They know how much business they're doing, but yet, once again, the National Enegy Board did not ask Trans-Mountain to provide current, accurate statistics. They simply picked a number that they liked. Now, when they say existing is 5 per month, and they calculate a percentage increase of traffic, because they said it, that's the number people use. But if that 5 tankers is actually 2.5, doesn't that double the increase in traffic? So it wouldn't be 700. Would it be something closer to 1,400?
You know, when you think about the number of times the increase, absolutely, it increases increasingly. I mean, we know that accidents are a function of density, and the more traffic you have, the more incremental traffic you have, the greater the risk. But I think this whole thing of this falsification of the tankers that had been loaded historically, that falsification where they said typic 5 when it was not by facts, speaks to a really big problem here, and that is it's a very simple number. How many tankers did you load by month or by year over, to the present? Very simple number, and Trans-Mountain has that number. But the board never checked. Trans-Mountain was telling them the truth about the number, and it never asked for them. I shouldn't say it never asked. It didn't seem important to the board to have accuracy over tanker traffic. Like, the board didn't care, so it didn't ask. Kinder Morgan deliberately misled the board, but Kinder Morgan didn't care because it knew it could get away with it. And then this is an interesting thing. You repeat something often enough, and even when people are presented with the facts about it, they don't change the information. So when I wrote to the provincial government here in British Columbia and said, you're saying 7 times, but it's actually, closer to 20 times, because I wrote back when, like, for example, in 2016, there were only 15 tankers for the whole year. That's 1.25. And so it's 20, wow. It's 20 times, not 7. The province of BC kept saying 7 times because that's what everybody understood. And so this is the problem with deliberate falsification to create a bias, is that it becomes common knowledge. And so even when people are told it's wrong, they keep repeating it. And that's what Trans-Mountain from the beginning has hoped for. And that's what the board has relied on to continue to rig the decision to approve the project. It's huge risk. It doesn't have the economic benefits we're being told, and it's not commercially viable. So instead of just saying, what, the project doesn't work, we find that it's being subsidized to force fit it into a belief that vested interests have created that it's wanted and needed when it's not. And so for all the parties that are thinking, gee, maybe there's a better way than creating a pipeline that's not needed, and that if it's used, it's just going to expand oil sands growth by 25%. Maybe what we should do is something else. That becomes very difficult for that discussion to take place about, well, what else might we do when all of the time, money, and effort from the proponent Trans-Mountain at the time with Kinder Morgan, the oil producers, the board, the government, and the media, the mainstream media, have built this huge belief that we have to build it when it doesn't make sense. It's really hard to have an intelligent, logical discussion about whether or not maybe things have changed and we should do something different when so much effort has been put into falsifying the need and usefulness.
Well, I'm just going to read a paragraph from your letter here. And I mean, listeners, just listen to this and tell me, after hearing this, how in the world this can be an accurate process. The board was advised during its review that Trans-Mountain's claim of 5 tankers a month was exaggerated and suspect. Yet, when the board was provided with an opportunity to require the Trans-Mountain file accurate figures, instead of ensuring Trans-Mountain did so, the board sided with Trans-Mountain's argument for refusing to supply the information. Trans-Mountain claimed that a request for accurate tanker traffic figures was a quote-unquote fishing expedition. And the board agreed. If that doesn't demonstrate regulatory capture.
In a large sense, Kinder Morgan had a lot at stake, now the federal government, for pretending tanker traffic right now is bigger than it is. And we have very reliable statistics now. David Huntley is a commenter, and he's filed a letter on the board which gives the tanker numbers and by name and date of loading. We know that there were only 18 for 2017 for the whole year. So here's what they get from lying about 5 tankers a month. That allows them to pretend that the deliveries to Westridge Dock are at a maximum. So the dock is capable of of having, 79,000 barrels a day delivered, and it can load up to 5 tankers a month if it has that. So when you say that there's a maximum delivery to the dock, it pretends that there's excess demand for tidewater access. When you actually look at the oil that gets delivered to the dock to be loaded on tankers, reflected in, say, 15 tankers for a year, what it says is that there's a lot of tidewater access. In fact, in 2016, if 5 could have been loaded and only 1 a month was, then that means there's not a demand for tidewater access. But this entire project is based on the whole notion that there's this huge excess demand for tidewater access. It's very similar to the capital cost fabrication, that the cost went up to $6.8 billion and the board wasn't advised, so therefore the board's report could erroneously pretend it was 5.5. Is that there's a benefit from these false numbers, that if the proper numbers were provided, it would expose the lack of financial viability and the lack of economic benefit from the project. So if there isn't the tidewater demand, why are we rushing to get this to Asia? Well, we're rushing to create a pipeline because oil producers need more pipelines than they can use, because when they have failures, they want to have alternate systems to shift the oil to.
This brings us back to now, since the Federal Court of Appeals order that marine traffic and its effect pursuant to the Species at Risk Act must be incorporated, this must cause a huge problem for actually putting accurate tanker numbers in, because I'm sure the reaction from the public from a 700% increase to a 1,400% increase would not be conducive to public acceptance, shall we say. But now we find a direction, as we mentioned before. Now we are not going with the traditional 200-mile economic sea limit, but it's 12 nautical miles. Is that a way to combat the possibility that real tanker data will be brought into this? Is this 12-mile limit have something to do with preventing disclosure of what the risks are to these different whale species in the South Salish, even going all the way out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca? The other question I have for you, is this a way of limiting Washington State from getting involved? Because, of course, they have their own process for environmental review and for protecting large mammals at sea. Is this a way of trying to eliminate future litigation by limiting?
Well, I think by limiting it to 12 nautical miles instead of 200 nautical miles, what the board is exposing itself to is more litigation, because it's not reasonable. Canada defines the 200-mile limit as what it's responsible for. The shippers themselves, the shippers on Trans-Mountain, the ones that have committed to long-term capacity at the dock, in the Part 4 hearing, when they looked at the toll methodology and there was cross-examination, the shippers expected that the territorial waters would be included. And in fact, the shippers expected to pay for a protection plan like the Ocean Protection Plan. So no, what we've got is a situation where the 12 nautical mile, this false limitation, is to reduce any estimate of risk, to actually reflect the risks to the oceans from this project and the tanker traffic triggered by it. What we also have is the board is refusing to look at accurate tanker numbers because they've accepted the evidence that was filed in 2013 with the report when the application was made. So the board has no intention of requiring accurate incremental tanker traffic data. The board is ignoring the evidence that shows that it's not typically 5 a month. And the board is not allowing the proper scope of the risk to include 200 nautical miles, which would also include the migratory paths of the killer whales. By arbitrarily stopping it pretty much at the south of Vancouver Island, you don't have to look at that risk. So it's really an indication of how the board is exposing itself to more litigation. The other thing that's really confusing to me is the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 says that you have to look at international waters. So, for example, the concerns of Washington should be addressed by this board, but they've scoped it out. So if anything, I think they're opening themselves up to even more litigation if Washington wanted to pursue it, or the United States.
This doesn't make any sense at all to me. And I mean, when this 12-mile limit was announced, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, who was involved in the Tsleil-Waututh law case, he said, "We're astounded at the new NEB process that is more flawed than the process we fought so hard against when it was Kinder Morgan's project. They noted that the regulator has decided to only review impacts of the project within 12 nautical miles of Canada's territorial sea limit as requested by the Alberta government, instead of considering Canada's exclusive economic zone, which extends 200 nautical miles. They say this decision is flawed based on research showing that the habitat of the whales extends well beyond 12 miles. Now, Dr. Robert Steedman, who is the Chief Environmental Officer of the National Enegy Board, said the decision to limit the area of the assessment to 12 nautical miles, known as the territorial sea limit, was based on the comments received from interested parties. Well, apparently, interested parties only includes proponents. How could they arbitrarily cut this back to basically 10% of the limit that is traditional? When they say interested parties,
you see, this is an interesting
exactly are they talking about?
Thing that they do publicly. So the environmental person speaking on behalf of the NEB says we properly evaluated whether or not we should go to 200 nautical miles. But you see, when they talk about applies to interested parties, and I read them all, the parties that spoke on behalf of 12 nautical miles was the Government of Canada, Trans-Mountain, and the Alberta government. And so then the province of BC was silent, which is also disturbing, given how they've said that they are concerned. But the province of BC was silent, but every other participant spoke for 200 nautical miles. So there is not a correct reflection of what occurred, stated by the environmental officer from the NEB. That is a misrepresentation. It's deliberate to try to pretend that proper reflection was made by the board when it didn't. You see, and they keep doing this, but they don't realize that we still have a court system that we can trust. They're actually setting up more litigation and court cases to go over this again as to whether or not the board properly looked at this question after the court told it to go back and do it. If it was going to be done, it had to be reconsidered by the board. So Ottawa is setting itself up for more court action. And even if they have a permit and they start constructing it, here's what they're putting on the Canadian public on the hook. Because the Canadian public has an interest in the board doing a proper review. Because if a certificate is offered under a flawed process, as appears to be the case, more court action, Ottawa gets its certificate, it starts construction, and a year into construction, when $3 billion has been spent, and the court says certificate squashed, and then the project stops, well, that's a lot of money to spend to have a project stalled because due diligence wasn't done properly. And so Canadian taxpayers, because we're now the owners, are on the hook. Kinder Morgan would never have done what Ottawa is planning to do. Kinder Morgan would never have started construction without having all of the court action finalized. So you have a government that's willing to take the risk that Kinder Morgan would never take, but they're doing it with taxpayer money. We know, even though and I say Kinder Morgan would never have started construction because Kinder Morgan filed their construction plans. And despite the public information they provided suggesting they were into construction, they weren't. They had started Westridge Marine Terminal, but relatively little money was spent there. And all the rest was planning. It was a couple of trees were removed, that kind of thing. It was not construction as we would normally define it. They would not start construction until all of the court challenges were finished. The same reason Northern Gateway would not get firm shippers until all the court challenges were finished. But now we've got Ottawa making decisions that no imprudent company would ever make. And they're doing it because they have deep pockets with taxpayer money.
I mean, I'm looking here at an article by Carl Meyer that was in the National Observer, September 21st, and it was about the reconsideration that Ottawa gave to the National Enegy Board. And it says, the unanimous Federal Court of Appeal ruling said the NEB made a critical error when it decided not to include oil tanker traffic in the scope of the project. That meant the board ignored the consequences to the environment of increased tanker traffic off the BC coast, which the court said sparked a chain reaction of unacceptable deficiencies that tainted the NEB's final report. So they think that 12 miles is going to make up for not looking at it at all. I agree with you that this doesn't make any sense from a legal standpoint because the UBCIC and Stand Earth and all the other groups, they're not going anywhere. they're going to file again. Wouldn't we expect the same result, that this is going to get quashed? Because it's not good practice, what they're doing. They're trying to rig the game. And up to this date, the courts have done what's right. I would hope that the courts do not get convinced to do something else. I can't see how without even bigger problems. But is this just really an issue of the thing that we saw with Site C?
That is a deliberate strategy, absolutely. You know, and it's interesting because here's what the National Energy Board did that a lot of people don't appreciate because it was it's a little bit complex. The National Energy Board has to review the project under the National Energy Board Act, and because it's a designated project under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, under that act. But because the National Energy Board said that the marine traffic triggered by the project was not part of the project, they didn't have to look at marine tanker risk under the CEA Act, but they did look at that risk under their own National Energy Board Act. That's why we have evidence on the record regarding tanker traffic, because they said they would look at the marine risk under their own NEB Act, which doesn't have as strong requirements as under the CEAA. But we won't look at marine tanker traffic under the CEAA. Now that they've been forced to do it by the courts, they're just using the evidence that they had at the original hearing and pretending that that is enough to now look under the lens of the CEAA 2012. So you see how it's kind of been piecemeal together? And had the NEB not tried to pull a fast one on the, because let's face it, if anybody had heard that Trans-Mountain was being looked at by the NEB, but they would not consider tanker traffic, it would have been a non-starter. There is no way the public would have put up with a review of the project without looking at the marine impact. So the board cleverly did it under their own act. So the public thought the risk was being looked at of marine tanker traffic, but then they didn't look at it under the lens of the more strident Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So when they came up with the decision that, yes, there were adverse environmental impacts, particularly as they pertain to orca whales, they didn't have to then say, are those impacts justified under the circumstances as is required by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act? They could just say, yes, there's an adverse environmental effect. Yes, the orcas will become extinct, but we're not going to address that because we don't have to under the National Energy Board Act. And that's how the report's written. So when it was taken to the court said, you fundamentally flawed here because you didn't look at this under the Environmental Assessment Act, and you have to. So I think what the board is up to now is, and the federal government, how can we get away with the least that's required to avoid being found guilty again at a court case? And so the federal government is undertaking consultation with First Nations that is now going to amount to more than just note-taking. And the National Energy Board is going to look at the marine tanker traffic under this lens of the CEAA. When the court cases are triggered by this, because it's the bare minimum, the question will become, did the NEB err enough to warrant a finding by the courts that they did so? And did Cabinet err enough to warrant a finding by the courts? And they might just get away with it. That's the question. That's what they're betting they can do by having this flawed process. The intervenors, of course, are certainly, after this is all over, would be prompted to take Canada to court. Absolutely. Because again, we are watching a travesty take place.
So in your opinion, the 12-mile limit is their risk assessment for what they can pacify the system that, yes, we did what the Federal Court of Appeal decision demanded, so right. We've cleared that hurdle. But then people who are not in agreement will say 12 miles doesn't cut it, and they're going to try and say that it does.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see how it's going to be, maybe argued, because when you read Trans-Mountain's submission on the 12 nautical mile, they say, well, you didn't bring this up before. So, when I withdrew in 2014 from the hearing, because I knew the 12 nautical mile was a deliberate attempt to minimize the risk so that Canadians would think that things were safe, right? In my letter of withdrawal in 2014, I said there's no way under which this process could be legitimate when it's restricted to 12 nautical miles. They set up all this scope in the first hearing. It's just that they didn't put this under the lens of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act requirements. And, it was a sham then. But what can sometimes be argued is, well, we had the first hearing. That was the scope then. This is the scope now. We haven't done anything wrong. That's a potential argument.
Well, Robyn, once again, you come to the view up here. You bring realities. You bring facts. You bring conflict with the public narrative, which seems to be getting larger in its exaggeration by the day as the deliverers of the same thing get louder by each passing day. It looks like Ottawa intends to build this. Come hell or high water, they've basically said that. Everybody knows it. I'm sure nobody knows it more than Big Oil, who is now rubbing their hands together because the person they're going to be going to for a deal to, quote unquote, keep them interested has no ceiling on how much money can be had from them. What is the long-term issue you see with this flawed process being guaranteed passage? What will be the end result? I'm not really looking at 30 years down the road, even 5 or 10. What is this going to do that it's not going to deliver on, but we were promised?
Well, the real tragedy here is lost opportunity. It's interesting that the $80 million a day, which is falsely delivered, is a notion of lost opportunity. The lost opportunity, they say, is had we built more pipelines, there would be no differential, and therefore we'd have money in our pocket. But opportunity loss is an important concept. What do we lose out when we make one decision over another possible future? And what building pipeline capacity when it's not necessary does is it crowds out other opportunities to diversify the Alberta economy, to deal with the fact that the world demand for heavy oil is declining, the fact that fossil fuel extraction is not going to be a sustainable activity going into the next decade or so. When I say fossil fuel extraction, I mean a growth rate. I don't mean leave it all in the ground. What I mean is the industry is capable at where it is right now, and we have to figure out how to sustain that level of production and diversify our economies so that we can do other things that are going to provide benefits and real wealth. And so the real loss here is the loss of opportunity when you focus on a pipeline that isn't going to do what we're being told it's going to do, and wasting money, years, and effort when we could have been doing something else. And so I think that's the real tragedy, is the missed opportunity. We're missing that opportunity because we are being misinformed. Things are being misrepresented, and in fact, we're being lied to.
So anybody listening that wants to get a better grip on what the reality is as compared to the narrative, what do you suggest they do?
Well, I still believe very strongly in our democratic institution, and I still believe very strongly in our capitalist market economy. So people can vote through their pocketbooks, they can vote with their feet, and they can make their interests known by the usual channels, writing letters to their MP and making sure that when we're sold lies like $80 million a day, we call it out, whether it's through blogs or social media or whatever we have, opportunities for us to keep the accountability and the transparency as open as possible. I think it's also important, though, that as this unfolds, do not underestimate the power of people showing up to protect our future by protesting the pipeline. And so what we see happening is that there are people right now willing to get arrested because they understand that this is not a good project, and that it's important that these people not be demonized for standing up and saying, look, we haven't had due process, we haven't had due diligence, and we haven't had the proper dialogue about whether this project is good for Canada, because we've relied on a false regulator and a government. Justin Trudeau said you couldn't trust the process and he would redo the review. But within days of being elected, industry got to him and he changed his mind. Nothing's changed. It's still not a good process. And so if we allow this project to be built when it's violated Canadians' trust, what it means is that we're just going to see more and more of that. We're just going to see the erosions of our institutions that are there to ensure that our economy is healthy. This is a problem for all Canadians. And what I would suggest people do is calmly and rationally continue to understand that there are reasons other than just the protection of the environment this project shouldn't proceed. And those reasons are it's not economically beneficial to Canada and it's not financially viable. And it sends the wrong signal, not only in Canada, but to the rest of the world, that government can be played to subsidize business if you just strategize well enough.
So as you mentioned, the precedent that was set when the NEB finally got a cost-benefit analysis that favored rejection. They simply said, well, we're not going to ask for them anymore. So this precedent, I can't see anything good coming from establishing a precedent like this. Maybe we'll be better off if nobody does propose another big pipeline, because who knows how far the Canadian public will have to bend over for that one.
Well, you see, this is the interesting thing, is that there isn't going to be another major project like this because it's not going to be needed. And if Trans Mountain's built, it's going to be a white elephant, one way or the other. And so the thing that's important here is that the precedent that's being set is one that says we no longer have due diligence. And I've said this from the beginning. Had a proper, transparent review been done that reflected the public interest, I would have accepted the outcome of that process. Whatever had been decided under due process, I would have accepted the outcome. But without due process, the evaluation that we were told was being done, then you cannot rely on the decisions that are made because they weren't based on sound decision making. You don't run a business like that. Business people don't make decisions based on bad information. They require sensitivity analysis, they require scenarios, and they make decisions based on access to information. That's not happening here, but we're being sold it as if it is, and that's the betrayal. And so without due diligence, Canadians have to say, sorry, the project can't proceed because the process didn't work. We violated our principles to get to yes, and that is not a good message to send to anybody. That if you can figure out how to play the system, you can get what you want. That will destroy the market system, that will destroy democracy, and it destroys a civilized society, because there's one major principle that they all rely on, and that's access to good information. That's what makes competition work. That's what makes democracy work. And what we have here is that basic criteria has been removed. We have a process that is based on bad information while the public is being told it's not. So then you get the results you get.
And I would just like to stress that that was by design that was removed from the process. So I guess perhaps in a few years, when the first proposals for Ring of Fire come up, who knows what we're in store for, even under C-69.
If that ever gets passed.
Oh, it's in the Senate. It'll happen. Don't worry. Robyn Allan, I thank you for your expertise and your insight into this never-ending issue. I know you will be watching. I know you will be keeping track, and I know that there will be enough people who understand what's going on, who will be looking for your opinion and your input on this issue as it gets closer to what appears to be, by the end of February, a new certificate. Once again, thank you for being on The View Up Here once more, Robyn.
My pleasure. Thanks, Glenn.
There we go. Definitely my thanks to Robyn Allan. I just want to explain, people may have noticed that there were a couple fact sets that were repeated during that interview. This was recorded on 2 separate days. There was an issue on the first day that my end was a complete failure. What actually happened is we recorded close to an hour, and then my computer lost the file. So that involved a second day. And it was a little difficult in keeping things very detached. But the reason I left them in is because the same facts led to different tangents of what is wrong with this project. And it was, you deserve to hear these facts more than once in 2 hours because they're ridiculous. But if you notice that, that's why it's there. I don't think it's that noticeable, but, by now, after editing and everything else, this is like the 5th time I've heard it, so apologies. There are a few other short articles I want to cover in the time we have left. Now, as we mentioned, as Robyn stressed, the nonstop barrage of how good this project is, especially in Alberta. This is an opinion piece that was in the Edmonton Journal, October 23rd, from J. David Hughes of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA. The title is Selling Off Oil Fast as We Can Isn't an Energy Plan. Mr. Hughes says, we are told that any effort to curb oil and gas production will have disastrous effects because the industry generates the revenues that provide government services. But the facts show that returns to Canadians from royalties on oil and gas have plummeted. Data from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, our good friends CAP, show that royalties paid by industry fell 44% between 2000 and 2017, from $11.9 billion to $6.6 billion, a period in which hydrocarbon liquids production increased by 77%. The effective Canadian royalty rate decreased from 18.3% on $65.1 billion of sales revenue in 2000 to 6.2% on $107.1 billion in 2017. The situation in Alberta is even worse, where the effective royalty rate decreased from 19.5% to 5.1% over this period. The federal government also tells us that its purchase of the TMX is in the national interest, based on false claims that exporting Alberta bitumen to Asian markets will provide higher prices. But the U.S. Gulf Coast has the world's largest concentration of the complex refineries needed to optimally refine heavy oil. 2 new pipelines to the U.S. with double the capacity of TMX are under development, which will eliminate pipeline capacity constraints well before the earliest TMX completion date of 2022. Transport costs to the U.S. Gulf Coast are lower than sending oil to Asia via TMX and tankers. Together, these factors mean Alberta's heavy oil will sell in the U.S. for $2 to $5 more per barrel compared to Asian deliveries. The bottom line, Canada has no energy plan beyond pedal-to-the-metal export of its non-renewable energy assets. The rhetoric from Premier Rachel Notley's government that the sky will fall without TMX and the federal government's national interest justification for buying it have no merit. It's time to look at the big picture and develop a viable energy plan that will meet Canada's long-term energy needs and emissions reduction targets. Like I said, that's the Edmonton Journal. There is a little bit out there, but you're certainly not going to see people like David Hughes or Robyn Allan on the National. Let's put it that way. The other thing I want to look at is from The Energy Mix. The author is Paul McKay. His title is Panic in the Oil Patch Suites. Addicted, outwitted, conscripted, conflicted. If there was any doubt that Alberta and Ottawa are obsessed with accelerating tar sands exports at any fiscal, legal, or ecological cost, or that petropolitics and panic can vanquish sober judgment at the speed of a soundbite, those few hours during the last dog days of August were proof enough. Now there's more. The price at which U.S. refiners are willing to purchase Alberta bitumen has plunged since early September. Currently, those refiners are paying almost $75 per barrel for oil from Texas, the Gulf Coast, or North Dakota, or for imported high-quality crude. But they will now pay less than $30 for a barrel of Alberta bitumen. Are the U.S. refiners singling out Canada for punitive pricing? No. They are supplier agnostic, equal opportunity, privately owned, profit-seeking petro predators. Their business model is to maximize margins by buying crude as cheaply as possible, then selling refined products like gasoline, jet fuel, chemical feedstocks, marine diesel, and heating oil at the highest price possible. Nothing delights refiners in the U.S., China, Europe, Russia, the Persian Gulf, or India more than a surplus of available crude oil. It drives down their biggest input cost, allows them to choose between suppliers and grades and blends, schedule deliveries months in advance, and even configure runs to receive and refine oil to maximize operating efficiency and obtain the highest margins possible. In effect, refinery managers don't buy crude oil. That's done by sophisticated software that models oil prices, availability, refinery design, and demand for high-value refined products. Currently, U.S. refinery software algorithms are deciding the discount gap between Texas oil and Alberta bitumen. Refineries in the Midwestern U.S. that are configured to process bitumen are already at full capacity, and those on the U.S. East and West Coasts are negligible potential candidates. Only a few refineries in the Texas Gulf Coast area have theoretical capacity to process more Alberta bitumen, which would be via the proposed Keystone XL. But that will likely vanish soon. The main reason is that a boom in shale oil production in the nearby Texaco, New Mexico Permian Basin is flooding U.S. refineries with much higher quality oil. It's more costly to buy than bitumen, but cheaper to refine, does not impair refinery circuits, and produces significantly higher portions of premium refined products that garner the highest prices. These can be sold in the U.S. or exported via supertanker to customers in Europe and Asia. In short, Permian Basin oil is a far better fit for the only U.S. refineries capable of handling more bitumen, and will likely be for at least the next decade. In the last week of September, the Permian output was so prodigious that even despite domestic refinery demand and surging exports, U.S. oil inventories jumped 8 million barrels for the month. This spelled glad tidings for U.S. refiners, but dismal news for bitumen producers. Equally ominous, global oil behemoth Saudi Arabia has now entered North America as a major competitor. Last year, state-owned Saudi Aramco bought full control of the continent's largest refinery complex, the Motiva plant in Port Arthur, Texas. In the last year, Saudi Arabia has also doubled the volume of oil exports to the U.S. to 1 million barrels per day. With an oil well production cost of about $10 per barrel, the world's largest proven reserves of high-quality oil, and a fleet of ocean tankers capable of carrying 2 million barrels in a single cargo, the Saudi-owned Motiva refinery is assured high margins for the foreseeable future and already has co-owned petrochemical plants and a gas station chain in the U.S. So the Saudis have zero reason to buy or refine extra Alberta bitumen in the U.S. In fact, the planned expansion at the Motiva refinery has been scrapped, and Aramco is displacing Canadian oil with its own imports. Moreover, the Saudis are a decade ahead of Canada in establishing major oil customers in Asia and are accelerating new joint venture refinery projects in India, Malaysia, South Korea, Pakistan, and China. Their game plan is obvious. Co-finance mammoth new refineries adjacent to Asian ocean ports, which use Saudi oil delivered by Saudi megatankers to make high-value petrochemicals and low-sulfur marine shipping and vehicle fuels. There we go. I mean, what more proof do you need? There are no Asian markets. This is a lie. This is a massive, massive lie. And it's not that the evidence to prove it false is hiding, just nobody talks about it. Nobody refers to it. I just remind you that Robyn Allan has given her estimate of the Kinder Morgan purchase and the construction of TMX. In total, she believes it will be somewhere around $20 billion. And that leads me to the next thing I want to cover from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. They wrote a paper in June of this year, written by Tom Sanzillo, maybe Sanzio, I'm not sure, Director of Finance for the IEEFA, and Kathy Hipple, Financial Analyst of the IEEFA. The title is Canada's Folly. Government purchase of Trans-Mountain Pipeline risks an increase in national budget deficit by 36% and ensures a 637% gain by Kinder Morgan. Couple things I'm going to read out of this. The executive summary of the report. The Government of Canada has decided to purchase the incomplete Trans-Mountain Pipeline system from Houston-based Kinder Morgan in hopes of ensuring that this particular piece of Canada's oil industry infrastructure is completed. The Canadian government is buying the unfinished pipeline at a high price and will likely resell it for far less than it will pay to complete it. As a fiscal matter, the Canadian government will lose. As a financial matter, Kinder Morgan Incorporated will gain. The IEEFA estimates that this transaction and the cost of further planning and construction will require a $6.5 billion unplanned expenditure to Canada's budget during fiscal year 2019. It will increase Canada's projected deficit of $18.1 billion by 36% to $24.6 billion. The transaction risks an increase in Canada's annual deficit in fiscal year 2020 as well, reversing a deficit reduction trend that supports Canada's quote-unquote strong recovery, sound fiscal position, and excellent credit rating. Kinder Morgan Incorporated and its Canadian subsidiary, Kinder Morgan Canada Limited, will share $3.89 billion from the sale of the pipeline to the Canadian government. IEEFA estimates that the return on outlay will total 637%. Kinder Morgan's profits, an acronym I can't remember, EBITDA. It means, gross, pretty much. Sorry. But Kinder Morgan's profit 2017 was $9.21 billion. If its operations in 2018 were to achieve the same profit, the resulting $2.6 billion in profits would amount to an approximately 29% increase year to year. Kinder Morgan Canada, revenues of $388 million, would add $1.2 billion, or approximately 309% year to year. To date, both Kinder Morgan and the Canadian government have made only limited disclosures regarding the transaction. The August closing date leaves time open for further review. The Canadian government can and should publicly release the documents necessary to facilitate a better understanding of the transaction and the many questions it raises. The evidence is out there. The protest is out there, and it's credible. Look around. RobynAllan.com. ROBYNALLAN. There's a lot of good writers on this stuff. David Hughes at the CCPA, PolicyAlternatives.ca, PolicyNotes.ca, TheNarwhal.ca, NationalObserver.com. Robyn publishes there regularly. They have an excellent environmental staff. And IEEFA.org. I think there'll probably be another one of these shows over this goddamn pipeline. We'll see. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it, even though I made it much more difficult than it had to be. Thanks once again to Robyn Allan. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to The View Up Here. Good night.